GT40 is easily my favorite car that's ever been made. I thought I had enough collective experience to build one myself. I was really unrealistic about how long it would take to build this car. A year and a half in, I sort of reached my breaking point, and I thought this might be the first project that I haven't finished. Once it was done, it was one of the most satisfying things in my life. I keep a stash of earplugs in the door because it is that uncivilized. It's rowdy, it's loud. Driving this car is a workout. You feel every crack in the road. You can't let your mind wander. You've got to stay focused. Even though you're surrounded by this noise, it's peaceful. It's almost meditative. It handles and it's planted. You can drive it really fast. It does everything you want it to do. I know every square inch of the car. If I just bought this car, it wouldn't feel the same. My name is Eric Dean, and this is why I drive.
Hey, welcome everyone to today's Haggerty's live stream. Now, during these odd times, we're stepping up our conversations with the most interesting car people. We're doing them every Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 1. You can watch them on Haggerty.com, on our YouTube page, or on our Facebook page. And there's a whole bunch of other fascinating material and a growing community on Haggerty.com/media. Please visit. Now, I'm your host, Larry Webster. I'm the host of the Haggerty Drivers Club magazine, which is naturally one of the many great benefits you get as being part of the Haggerty Drivers Club, which is the go-to organization for those who love cars. Today, we have a very special guest, Mr. Preston Lerner. Preston is a gifted writer, an amateur racer, and what you need to know for today is that he wrote a fantastic book called Ford GT, How Ford Silenced the Critics, Humbled Ferrari, and Conquered Le Mans. Now, he is the perfect expert to talk about my new favorite movie, just was released, Ford v Ferrari. So, Preston, welcome. How are you?
Hey, Larry, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate you taking this time. Looking forward to chatting.
Have you seen the movie?
I have.
Now, can we just back up a second? Like, this movie was on the Hollywood drawing board for forever, right? The Ford versus Ferrari battle. Those in the car world, we knew this was a fantastic story. It's been knocking around for a while, and finally somebody pulled it down, correct?
That's true. And they spent a lot of money, and a lot of smart people did it.
So, did you like it?
Well, everybody's a critic, right? And I understand these are some really creative people, and they spent a lot of money and put a lot of effort into it. And I appreciate that anyone's made a movie about racing. It's just a great thing. No, I didn't really care for the movie. It didn't work for me on a lot of levels. I didn't really mind that it didn't tell the true story because it's a movie, and no one was really looking for a documentary. But I just really didn't care for some of the racing material.
All right, well, maybe we should back up and say, essentially, what the movie chronicles is Ford went to buy Ferrari, was rebuffed at the final hour. Then Ford said, we're going to make Ferrari look bad. We're going to race at Le Mans, where Ferrari was dominant. And along the way, Ford hired Shelby, a bunch of really interesting characters. And it took them years, but finally they did beat Ferrari. And that was in 1966. And that's when that movie ends. But of course, we know the story about the GT40 goes on and on and on. So I'm surprised you didn't like it. I mean, there were parts of it that definitely rubbed me the wrong way, but I could get into the flow of it. I love the music. I love the shots of the car. And I loved how they portrayed Enzo Ferrari. Maybe that'd be the first place to start, where the whole genesis of the story was. So basically, Ford's bean counters decided that the post-war generation was going to want to have sporty and fun cars, and they decided to be more involved in racing, and buying Ferrari might be a way to do it. So they go to Italy, they do a bunch of accounting, and they're trying to draw up the contracts, and they're meeting with Enzo, and then it's like the final, all Enzo's got to do is sign the contract they've been working over, and he sees one thing he doesn't like, and then just decides, screw it, just kicks everybody out and moves on. Is that the way it went down?
Yeah, I actually liked that part of the movie. I thought that was well done. That was pretty close to what really happened. I mean, Enzo is a character straight out of a movie. I mean, let's face it, the guy was a screenwriter's dream.
Ferrari, yeah.
Enzo Ferrari, yeah, and he, like you say, he basically led Ford on, and they went all the way to the altar, and he got cool feet, and basically gave Ford the finger at that point. And there's no question Henry Ford was just totally pissed off about that.
Well, wait, hang on a second. So I've heard two different versions of this. One was that in the book they portrayed Enzo Ferrari. He needed money. So let's be clear about that. His company needed money. He founded it. It needed some dough. He was sort of on the back door telling Fiat that Ford might buy him, and this would be bad for Italy and bad for the nation and all that stuff. So he was sort of playing both sides. I've also heard he didn't really do that because the Fiat Ferrari deal came a couple of years after Ford had been rebuffed. And the real reason was that when he got into the nitty-gritty of the contract and he realized that Ford was going to have control over the racing budget, when all along he had said, all I care about is let me race. Once he realized that, he knew that they were not really listening to his wishes. So he said, this is a bad partner and I'm out, which is more like the truth.
I think the latter version. I mean, Enzo was a Machiavellian character, no question, and he was friendly with Johnny Agnelli, who owned Fiat, and eventually Fiat would buy Ferrari in '69. It's just several years later. But yeah, I think he got into this deal as basically as a way to support his racing program. He knew he needed money to do that, and Ford seemed like a likely way to do that. And I just think when it became clear to him that he couldn't run the show, he just didn't want to do it, and I believe that's the way it went down. And that's what it's portrayed in the movie, and I believe that's pretty accurate.
That is. And then who do you know, like which Ford executive had to deliver it to Henry Ford II, who was better known as the Deuce? Who had to go tell him? Or maybe they called him on the phone. Was that Beebe? Was it Iacocca?
No, it was Don Fry, who he was Iacocca's right-hand man, and he'd been sent over there to Italy and spent weeks negotiating personally with Ferrari. I mean, they had dinner together. They had all these epic rides in the canyon with Ferrari to terrify poor Don Fry. And I had to go back to Dearborn, and he literally had a private lunch meeting with Henry Ford II and told him what happened. And Ford exploded, and that's basically why Ford decided to go do Le Mans.
So the Deuce's reaction really was like, yeah, he exploded. He got very mad. He's like, we're gonna go humiliate Ferrari. Was it really like that?
That's what Don Fry always said, and I believe that's true. I mean, it's hard to say if that really everything started there. But I mean, obviously, Iacocca needed to come on board, and they needed to have everyone decide to spend all this money on the program. So everyone had to sign off on it. But clearly, if Henry Ford had not been totally annoyed as to Ferrari, this program never would have occurred. That's really where it began.
Yeah. So Henry Ford, the Deuce, there's a lot of corporate pride at stake, and he's not going to be rebuffed by a small Ferrari. So then the thing I thought the movie got really wrong was so this was 63 when Ferrari told him he's not going to sell, right?
Right.
And then what?
Well, 63, 64. So they built the car. In 64. I mean, it would go to Le Mans for the first time in 64. So, and then it was several years before they actually won.
Right. So they spooled up this racing program incredibly quick after Ferrari rebuffed Ford, correct? It was like, what was it? But from the time the Deuce said, we're going to go to Le Mans, and they made it was what, 6 months, 8 months?
Yeah, it was less than a year. I mean, and what's really incredible is that they had no racing program at Ford. I mean, it wasn't like it is today where you have some people with expertise and they'd done stock cars, so they'd done Indy cars. I mean, no one knew anything. So they hired, or they didn't hire, but they chose Roy Lunn, who was a transplanted Brit who'd worked a little bit of racing on the British side before coming to Ford to run this program. And there was basically nobody at Ford who knew anything about building cars, which is why they ended up hiring Eric Broadley of Lola Cars to actually build the car. And everything was done in England. I mean, some of the design work was done in the States, but by and large, it was an English project.
So they
So that got lost in the movie, and that's, I mean, justifiable because they really want to play up Shelby's, the role that Shelby played. But Shelby didn't get involved until a year later, after the British team kind of didn't do the job. Ford wanted to bring it back in more close to the United States and more in-house, and they trusted Shelby, and so they entrusted him with the program.
So 64 cars break, 65 cars break. Is that when Shelby gets a stronger role along with the Holman Moody team, or was he sort of had an involvement all the way along because of course he's building those Cobras with their Ford engines. So he had a relationship with Ford. So he's guiding them, but he doesn't have like complete control. Is that right?
No, he had nothing to do with it in 64. So it was all done over in England in 64. And at the end of the 64 season, they had a disastrous performance at Nassau, which was the last race of the season, kind of a run what you brung deal. And all the Ford executives were there, and they watched the Fords get beaten not only by the Cobras, but they got beat by the Grand Sport, Chevrolet's big kind of cheater car. And they were totally humiliated, and they were pissed off, and they fired John Wyer, who had been the guy in charge of the program, and that's when they gave it to Shelby, right at the end of the 64 season. So he took over in 65 and actually won his first race at Daytona, which was a little misleading because Ferrari wasn't there. It wasn't like quite such a big deal, but it looked good to him. And he developed the cars in 65, and again, the cars got beaten again at Le Mans in 65, and so then they went back to the drawing board, and it wasn't until 66 that they actually went and beat Ferrari at that point.
Right. So was the movie accurate in that really the success of this program rested on Carroll Shelby's shoulders?
Well, I think, they obviously had to make it a little simpler than it was. It's a complicated story, and it was a complicated organizational structure. I mean, and Shelby, you met Shelby, I'm sure. He was a marketer. He was a salesman. He was a lot of things. A great driver. I mean, he wasn't an engineer. He wasn't a designer. He was sort of the organizational head. I mean, there were dozens, if not hundreds, of people who were involved in the program. So I think it's a little misleading to kind of credit Shelby with being the critical, the most critical person in the program. But clearly, if it hadn't been for Shelby, I'm not sure what would have happened, or maybe it'd taken longer to happen.
Yeah, the thing I love about Shelby is what a character. He's a very powerful human. When you met him, you understood like this is a guy with some personality. This is a guy with some drive. This is a guy who can get things done. So that part I really understood. The only thing that bothered me about the movie, and again, I loved it. I really enjoyed it. I've watched it 3 times. We bought a copy.
Really?
Watch it all the time. Totally. So much fun. Is that the person I've always heard was one of the unsung heroes of Carroll Shelby's success, in that he was just a natural engineer and fabricator and a mechanic, is Phil Remington. And the movie did not seem to give, he was kind of a bit player. And Phil was from what I've been told, he was the guy that really went in, re-engineered the car for the 65 season and started figuring out ways to make sure that it was going to survive a long race. Did your research bear that out, or what did you get?
Yeah, Rem is one of the great characters in racing history. I mean, he's probably one of the few non-racers or non-team owners who's actually well known in his own right. I mean, he was involved in Indy cars, and he was a hot rodder. He set records at El Mirage. In his own cars, he was an Indy car guy. He was a sports car guy. He worked on the Scarab. He then spent 30 years or 40 years with Dan Gurney and All American Racers. But yeah, I think Remington was the single most important person in the whole Shelby American team and the whole program. He was the guy who made sure fixes got made. He came up with his own great ideas. He came up with a quick change system for the brake pads, which they ended up using at Le Mans. Um, Later on, he basically designed the bodywork of the Mark IV, which won Le Mans in 67.
Wow.
He did it all by eye, working in the wind tunnel. I mean, really a really great guy. And actually, I spent a fair amount of time with him over the years. And what was so amazing about him was he never seemed to really understand how what a genius he was. He was kind of just another mechanic, fabricator, working. I mean, he would work in a shop apron. He had the same place in the shop for like 30 years, and but I mean, he was a real genius at so many elements of motorsport. And Pete Wiseman, who did the Wiseman transmissions and transaxles, is gone now, but he told me many years ago that if it hadn't been for Remington, the program would have been a complete disaster.
Isn't that amazing? All that money, all those people, it comes down to one guy, and he got short shifts. The other thing that the movie depicts Ken Miles, British driver who was one of those kind of combination driver, engineer, fabricator, developer in the 60s when, sports car racing was still quite new and they were learning a lot every year. He was another instrumental figure. And, the movie at the end in 66, when Ford won Le Mans in dominating fashion, there's this controversy about the finish. And first off, tell us the story about the finish. What was the controversy? What happened?
Well, it's a complicated story. I mean, you know it really well, Larry. I know, but at the end, the Fords were dominant in that race. Ferraris were really nowhere, and so as the race came down towards the end, it was clear that Ford was going to win. It was just a question of which car was going to win, and someone came up with the bright idea, so-called, of staging a dead heat finish, and they thought that would be.
We don't know who that someone was. Is that what I'm hearing in your voice?
I don't know who it was. It's hard to believe. I mean, in my book, I cite actually Bruce McLaren said he came up with the idea, which is weird because I can't think of a single race that ever ended in a heat finish. I mean, you? I'm not really sure why they would have thought it was going to work. As you can see, they tried to stage it.
They wanted to stage a finish where all three came across the line at the same time.
Correct. And actually, the third car was 10 laps down, but I mean, they wanted to look like all three going across the line at the same time. And originally, the Ford, the ACO, the Automobile Club of the West, said that would be cool. They were cool with that. And after it had already been decided upon to have Miles slow down to let McLaren catch up so they could have this dead heat finish.
Ken Miles is in the lead at the end.
I'm sorry, yeah. Ken Miles is in the lead. And that was a little misleading, too. There's this controversy about why he was leading. Charlie Agapu, who was his mechanic, said it was because he was faster. Bruce McLaren claimed that it was because Miles had broken team orders and had gone faster than he was supposed to. At any rate, he was leading. They told him to slow down, and they're supposed to cross the finish line together. But shortly before the end of the race, the ACO told Ford that they weren't going to allow a dead heat finish, that whoever covered the greatest distance would win the race. That was going to be McLaren because he had qualified behind Miles by about, I don't know. So they lined up about 10 yards apart. And at that point, there was no real way to explain to the drivers what was going to happen. So I think that Leo Beebe made the command decision, not to tell anyone what was going on, just let the race proceed. And if McLaren won the race, McLaren won the race. I don't think he had anything against Miles. Wasn't trying to prevent Miles winning the race, but he just wanted to make sure a Ford won the race, and that's what he had.
Yeah, that was the thing. The movie made it seem like Ken's such a great driver. He's way out in the lead, Ken Miles, and the win was stolen from him. But what I was trying to explain to my kids who were saying that, I was like, well, you have multiple cars in a 24-hour race. You expect that a significant portion are going to break. So you set different paces for each of them. Some get to drive fast, some get to drive slow. And then, at the end, you see what you have. So I think McLaren is probably closer to what was really going on. They all had their different paces, or they'd be told. So it wasn't a matter of, as the movie made it seem like, Ken was this driver of much greater skill than everybody else. You think that's fair?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you got to remember, I think Miles was an excellent driver, no question. He was in his 40s. He was a sports car driver. Bruce McLaren and Chris Amon were two top Formula One drivers. I mean, they were great drivers in their own right. I mean, without any question. McLaren had already won races. Amon probably go down in history as the greatest driver never to win a Formula One race. So I don't think Miles was faster than them. And you got to understand, as you say, in those days, half the cars used to break. So guys did not drive like they do today. They weren't on the limit for 24 hours. They were stroking it. They were 30 seconds off the qualifying times at the end of the race. They were just slogging around, clicking off laps to get to the end of the race. So it wasn't like anyone was really racing out there. They weren't dicing. I mean, there was no competition really to speak of. So all Leo Beebe wanted to make sure was that Ford won the race. And he didn't really care which Ford won the race. So as far as he was happy when it got finished, and obviously Ken Miles wasn't.
So the movie really ends with that win. It does have a little bit after that where, unfortunately, Ken Miles is killed in a testing accident. Was that, 67 or 68?
Later in 66.
Later in 66.
Hey, but
that year.
Larry, I got to ask you a question, though. So tell me, one of the things that bothered me most about the movie were like the racing scenes where at Willow Springs, where you see Miles yelling at Dan Gurney in the car, and you see them shifting. You constantly see him upshifting again, like there's another gear in the car, or stepping on the throttle. Didn't those things bother you at all?
No. I get it. This idea that when you want to go past somebody, you got to shift a gear. But what I think it signifies was that there's that point in the car when you have to drive aggressively, and it's a great state to be in when you suddenly feel at one in this machine, and the fear of crashing is gone, and you're just driving as hard as you can. So when I see that sort of is my signal that the movie makers are trying to get that across. So I'm okay with it because I don't know how you would visually show that any other way.
That's a good point. Okay.
But I get what you're saying. I mean, and the yelling at each other across my whole neighborhood I took to watch this movie, like 30 people, because they knew I'm the local car nut. And they were laughing at these parts, and I was like, yeah, it doesn't happen like that. That's not funny. That's just stupid. But they love it. So I was like, yeah. This is bringing them into this story, which we've known and we've loved. I'm all for it.
Okay.
Let's shift gears a little bit because 66, the Deuce wins. He's done it. He's vanquished Ferrari. The Ford GT40, really went on to have an amazingly long life for a race car. And, maybe this is a discussion for another time, be a great barroom discussion, but the Porsche 917 is held up, here. I mean, I might argue the GT40 is up there or higher. And, so after 66, did Ford what did they do? Did they keep racing it? Did they back away? What happened?
Yeah, actually, to me, 67 is more interesting than 66 because 66 was really a walkover. So they win the race, and then everyone thinks they're going to quit. And for some reason, and nobody really knows why, Henry Ford II decides they're going to keep racing. So they tested for the rest of the year because there were no real races they cared about except for Le Mans, the American races, Daytona and Sebring. And then they show up Daytona in 67, the first race of the year, with the new and improved Ford GT40, and they get trounced by Ferrari, by the new 330 P4, which is an iconic car in its own right. They just get killed. And so, all of a sudden, Ford's going, well, we've just optimized our car for 6 months, and we just got killed by Ferrari. What do we do now? And it turns out that
did they get killed because the Ferrari was faster, or was it because the Fords just had a fluke and broke down?
Well, it's true the Fords did break, but the Ferraris were faster too. I mean, it's not clear, what would have happened at Le Mans because that was a track that really favored the Fords, long straightaways, really favored high speed. But it wasn't going to be a walkover in '67 when they were facing these P4s. And Ferrari had retooled. They'd actually hired Chris Amon, who'd won, Le Mans the previous year. They had a better team and so on. So Ford dusted off this car called the J car, which is the car actually that Ken Miles had gotten killed in testing at Riverside. And the car had been a little bit draggy. It had a high drag coefficient. And Phil Remington took it to the wind tunnel at Dearborn and, working strictly by eye, reshaped the car. They redubbed the car the Mark IV, and that's the car that went to Le Mans '67. This was an all-American car. It was the chassis was designed in the States. It was built entirely in the States at Carcraft in Dearborn. And it went to the States, and it went to one with, Dan Gurney and it's like how more all-American can you get than that? So to me, that was the greatest that was the pinnacle of the Ford program. It was also the end of the Ford program. It was an all-American car with all-American drivers, and they
I
beat
think
everybody
that's
in the world.
the number one car that hopefully the viewers can see. That's the Mark
Right? Yeah.
IV, and that is it's fascinating how quickly they tooled that thing up, and it is in very much a clean sheet redesign from the GT40,
Yeah.
and the other part of this, and I'm with you. 67, the week in 67 between Le Mans in June, and then a week later, the Grand Prix of Belgium at Spa is the most incredible American week in motorsports that one could argue in international motorsports you ever had, right? Because who was driving the GT40 at Le Mans was AJ Foyt and Dan Gurney, right?
Yeah, I remember not only did Gurney win at Spa after, but Foyt had just won Le Mans. Had won Indy that year. So,
okay. So wow, I forgot about that. So Foyt wins Indy. Then he goes to Le Mans with Gurney. The two of them win Le Mans. And then Gurney takes off and he goes to Spa, which is a racetrack in Belgium. It's like one of the scariest, fastest. You got to have bravery out, either bravery or stupidity to be fastest. And he goes in there with a car, Formula One car, was built in Southern California,
yeah.
which nobody's building Formula One cars in America. And he wins. So it's like the first time an American car won a Formula One race. I mean, I can't imagine what it must have been like to be Dan Gurney that week. It must have felt, well, really, really good.
Yeah, and he was thrilled. He was thrilled to win Le Mans. He had actually, been to. I think he went to Le Mans 10 times and had DNF'd 7 times, and so yeah, you can see it there in the picture. I mean, that's just supposedly where he invented the champagne splashing ceremony. So, which is pretty cool.
So the 67 race, they had to drive a lot harder than they did the previous race. It was a real race, the 67 Le Mans race.
It was, and almost all the Fords broke except for Gurney and Foyt led from the first hour to the end of the race, and they drove. They were chased the entire race by the Ferraris. And in fact, the picture you showed before, that was the before time Ferrari, the Ford and the S's, and Ford, Gurney and Foyt had him covered, but they had to run the whole way. And it wasn't a walkover. And if they had broken, that was it. Ferrari would have won because I think Ferraris finished second and third. So it was pretty cool.
Ford leaves after 67. And then, there's all kinds of rule changes within sports car racing that make cars competitive or not competitive. But the GT40, they built, 1,000 of them, give or take, right?
No, like 133, actually.
Oh, whoops, 133. But then those things...
That's still a lot.
But they continued racing in privateer hands for years, right?
Yeah, and John Wyer, so he was the guy who started the Ford program in 64. So he got kicked to the curb. They let him continue to stay in England, but Shelby was given control of the program. But, Wyer kept these GT40s. And the funny thing was when the FIA changed the rules, they created a homologation class in Group 5 and said if you built more than 100, you could run engines at 5 liters. Well, so they'd already built 133 Ford GTs. So the idea was they wanted to promote a 3-liter class because that was the formula in Formula One, and they kind of figured the prototypes would run 3 liters. But Wyer says, "Hey, we got 100 of these. We qualify for Group 5, so let's run the GT40s." And they ran them with the 302 Cleveland motors in them, or something similar to the 302s Cleveland's. And they won 67 pretty easily. In 67, they beat Porsche, both the 917s, which all broke, and the 908s. So, and that was the race that ended, X won by 100 yards at the end of the race. It was a pretty thrilling race. So 4 years in a row, 4 GTs won Le Mans, which is pretty impressive.
Wow, that's impressive. Just for anybody listening live, the question line is open. Put your questions in there. We'll see if we can answer them. What is, back in the 60s when they were still learning so much about suspension design and geometry and aerodynamics, the transfer from the racetrack to the street cars was very apparent, and there was a lot to be learned by racing and failing very quickly. Were there any big parts of the GT40 program that you think advanced? I've got one in my head that I think advanced the state of passenger car development and construction, but what's yours? Do you have any?
Uh-oh. Now I'm going to seem like an idiot here, Larry. I mean, the aerodynamics would eventually work their way over. There's some ergonomics in the cockpit. Tell me
Right.
yours. I'm sorry, I'm kind of drawing a
Well, the one
blank.
thing that I think gets forgotten is, and it's not very like it's not something you can point to and look at and go, ah, that's it. But I think if you look at all that they had to do to an engine to get it to produce a lot of power, but also to make it survive, and then those special test cells that Ford built, where they had the cars running through a simulated, essentially computer controlled before computers really existed, simulation of Le Mans twice in a cell that would tilt the motor to simulate the G forces and really give a realistic view of what the engines were going through. So, you had about to that point 60 years of accumulated engine experience, but then that was when they were really looking at longevity, the development, the testing, and then all the little materials that made that possible. I mean, would you say that's fair?
Yeah, I think that's Ford. That's where they kind of developed the whole idea of doing R&D for racing. I mean, they tested relentlessly and religiously. And you mentioned like the test cells there at Dearborn. I mean, they ran motors for. They didn't run it for quite 48 hours. I think they ran. I think the most they ever reached was like 44 hours on a motor. But yeah, every one of them was dynoed ahead of time. It's really fascinating because you'd see all the horsepower numbers before the race and after the race. They charted all that stuff, so it was fascinating to see, who got the better motors and how they held up during the race. They actually held up incredibly well. Maybe lost a couple of horsepower was all, but it wasn't just, the engine development was everything. It was brakes, tires, the aero stuff. All this was brand new, and it was still an era, unlike today where kind of we sort of know everything and we're working on the margins. Back then they were able to take big swipes at things, and that's kind of cool.
Well, the other thing that I think gets overlooked is just the construction of the car. So the GT40, correct me if I'm wrong, is what's known as a monocoque, which means they used sheet. I think it's steel or aluminum, like thin sheets,
Steel.
right? Is it steel? And then they fold it over and rivet it and to make like sections, kind of like a frame. Previous cars were mostly built with a steel tube frame with a body draped over it. Once you go into monocoque, you employ the entire body to contribute to the structural stiffness of the car. So one of that car's, I would imagine its real advantages is that the platform was really stiff and it lets the suspension do what it needs to do. So it's a more predictable car, more comfortable car. I drove the 66 winner for a story that we did in the Haggerty Drivers Club magazine. And immediately I was like, yeah, I could be in this thing for 8 hours straight. No problem. It just did what you wanted. It was, super comfortable. And those sort of little learnings, I do think have an effect back on a big manufacturer like Ford. Is that fair too?
I think so. By the way, that was a really cool story. That was great, and I really envy you on that one. But yeah, the Ford. It's actually funny because one of the things that was funny is that Ferrari didn't care about how those drivers felt. I mean, they built the cars and drivers fit in them, and if they fit, fine, and if they didn't, that was their problem. Ford actually built ergonomics into the cockpit design. That's what they had those perforated seats. They were supposed to keep you a little bit cooler, and the seating position is pretty good. I mean, it's actually, as you say, it's a comfortable car. It's big. You can fit big people in there. Well, Gurney, they had to put a little roof blister in because he was too tall, but Ford was a big guy and he fit in there really comfortably.
Right.
So it's just interesting that they did consider those factors, which had never really been considered by a race team before, because they were a production car manufacturer. They weren't a race team. It's like that was their DNA, and I think that made it a little bit different than some other cars.
Yeah. Well, I feel like they really started to understand for a predictable chassis that's going to handle the way a driver wants, and the more comfortable a driver feels knowing his connection with the machine, the faster or the less likely they are to make mistakes. And so that focus on the stiffness of the structure so it doesn't twist, like for on the other end of the spectrum, you drive like a Beetle convertible or an MGTF and you go over a bump and the whole thing shudders and the wheels are doing all this thing in the suspension. That was one of the things that really struck me. And being around that machine and the attention to detail, the person who owns it, he reproduce like really fanatically how they had that car at the race, and the little twine that they used to make sure that the electrical connectors didn't come undone, and whatever other little tricks there were to make sure those cars survived the whole time. It was so much care and feeding into one machine. I mean, I feel this pang of nostalgia, even though I wasn't there, but I really wish I could have been.
The cars, I did a story actually on that restoration. That's like the most magnificent restoration I've ever seen, because they didn't do it they did it to make it exactly as it was in the morning, of the race. So the stuff that was done badly at the shop, they did badly on purpose. They could have made it look nicer, but they didn't. They made it look exactly like it looked then, with bad paint, bad rivets, whatever it was. So that's pretty.
Yeah,
fun.
we're really lucky. Rob Kaufman owns the car, and he's really, really generous about getting it out there, letting people see it. I know when we did our piece with it and the latest Ford GT race car, when we were done, we were at Virginia. He's in Charlotte. Just got a trailer. He loaded it up, got in his pickup, went home with this thing, and that was a very special day. But so Dustin McLaughlin, thank you for your question. He wants to know, was the brake change as depicted in the movie as big a deal in the actual race? And then let me explain it, Preston, where the brakes to last for 24 hours is a big deal. At the minimum, you're going to have to change the brake pads, and sometimes that takes a lot of time. You want to limit your time in the race. And what they showed in the movie was that they wheeled out an entire corner of the car with new brakes, and they just unbolted the one corner and bolted on the new one. Was that the way it was?
Unfortunately, no. That was and I understand why they did that, because to show the difference in doing a brake change in 1 minute as opposed to 3 minutes, it's not going to be too exciting. And the thing they showed in the movie was really the Audi deal from Le Mans, about 10 years ago, where they were able to change an entire, I think it's like a half shaft assembly with a spindle and everything. You just flop it out completely. What Ford was doing was they would change rotors, I believe, once in the race, and they had to change pads probably 3 or 4 times during the race. And so they just, and Ferrari didn't have to change pads nearly as often because the car was much lighter. So it was important to Ford to do it somewhat more quickly, and Remington came up with this way to change the pads more quickly, but unfortunately, it wasn't like the movie. So that was not accurate.
Yeah, I couldn't really see it. Yeah, what you were talking about, I think that was 2002 at Le Mans, when it was Audi and Porsche with these crazy prototypes, and the weak link for all of them were the transmissions, right? Mm-hmm. And might have been 98, but Audi has this car called the R8, and it's faster than anybody. It's leading the race. And I remember Aaron Robinson, one of our Haggerty writers, he had the best line about this thing. The rest of the field is so happy that the Audi is broken, and they know it's a transmission failure. And Audi pulls into the garage, and a gurney comes around, and they just unbolt the transmission and the whole back end of the car, yank it out, and a whole new one comes in, and they bolt the transmission up. It was like 4 minutes. Like, that is one of the greatest stories in racing right there. Because Aaron was like, you could hear the chins hitting the floor up and down the pit lane. And so that's one of the things I love about racing.
I remember talking actually to Brad Kettler, who was the American guy who worked on that program.
Yeah,
and they had practiced that. It wasn't like they just did it at Le Mans. It just happened that they were ready. No, they had practiced that ahead of time. So that's funny.
Well, I love racers, man. They're so into it. They're just so passionate about it. So here's a question from Michael Schubel. Was Leo Beebe portrayed accurately in the movie? And I guess maybe what he means is he was just kind of a jerk. What's your sense?
No, definitely not. I mean, and again, the movie they want a villain. I mean, you need a villain in a movie like this, and he was the guy. Because I think they made Enzo the villain, but that wouldn't really work as well. No, Leo, I think Beebe was by all accounts, a real stand-up guy. I mean, and he never would have done anything to in any way hurt Ford's chances of winning the movie. He, in fact, had more invested in this program probably than anybody. I mean, his job was on the line. They had lost their Le Mans. I mean, he would have been fired, I'm sure. So he just wanted to win, and I don't think he had anything against Miles. I think he was a little perturbed because Miles, again, allegedly disobeyed team orders. But it was like he had personal antipathy to him, but we wanted to do anything to get rid of him.
Well, that's interesting. There's this great card that we ran along with your I can't remember, was it probably your piece where you debunked a lot of this in the Haggerty magazine, was
Right.
from the Deuce, Henry Ford II, the big boisterous guy. He wrote to somebody, said, "You better win the Deuce." It was
Right.
a car. Was that to
I
Leo?
think we have that picture here somewhere.
Who was Leo? Was
Yeah,
that?
well, Leo. Yeah, that was Leo. That was to Leo Beebe, and I
Wow.
think I think there was several people got several cars, but Leo, he's showing it at Lamont to Johnny Agnelli. There's a pretty famous picture of that, and he carried that in his wallet for the rest of his life. Just said, "You better win HF2." So,
Because
yeah, and
Leo
he
went on,
was.
he became Goodyear's racing tire manager, right?
No, I think that's Leo
That was
Mill.
Leo Mel. All right, I'm mistaking it.
Yeah,
Yeah. Um,
yeah. He,
so
he
this is
was.
an interesting
He had a
question.
big corporate career.
Um, uh, there's a question that says, "What do you think about companies like Super Performance that build replicas of the GT40?" And good, bad, love them. This is a very opinion-based opinion. I will say I love them. Super Performance has this line called the tool room cars that are reportedly very accurately built to the originals. And a lot of the vintage racing in Europe, they if you own an original, they allow you to build one of these Super Performance as a replica, so you can race it and perhaps not be so worried about crashing your original. But yet, it's still supposedly doesn't have these modern advances that make it faster. I've driven some of these cars; they're really fun. They look accurate. There's a guy down in North Carolina who the last vintage race I was at, he had built like 6 of them, and they're out vintage racing. It was down at Sebring. I'm for it. I mean, where are you? Where are you on these things, Preston?
Well, I'll defer mostly to you because you actually do the vintage racing and you write about it. I don't, generally with you, I don't have any objection. And in fact, I remember Max Mosley at one point, the Formula head of Formula One or FIA, wanted to do all vintage racing with kind of replica stuff because he thought the real cars were just too valuable. Which is true maybe for the late stuff, but I don't have a problem with it. And I mean, I'm never going to get to have a Daytona coupe, a Cobra Daytona coupe. I mean, a real one. I mean, they only made 6 of them, right? Even if I wanted one, I couldn't get one. But to get in one of the super performance ones, I think that would be really cool. I'd do that. So I'm for it.
Yeah, it's Dennis Olthoff Racing down in North Carolina. He fields a bunch of these. But it's interesting. In our last issue of the Haggerty Drivers Club magazine, Jay Leno even talked about some replica Maseratis, the Persangs, and how they should be allowed. No, Bugattis. I'm sorry, the Bugattis. They should be allowed in the club. And there is a line, like how how faithful is it to the original one? You certainly want to be able to upgrade the safety aspects and things like that with fuel cells and maybe some belts and things like that. But to your point, you can buy a factory 5 Daytona coupe replica and you can make a pretty nice car out of it for a fraction of the dollar. And then you don't have to be so worried. You can be out enjoying it. And for enthusiasts that just, love these iconic shapes, to have one in your garage, I imagine it's got to feel pretty good.
Yeah, just the only risk, the only danger I think is that, of course, you can make them so much better. I mean, that's kind of the problem. Is you have a real one, yeah, and even the real cars out there. I mean, think of what you can do with a small block Chevy these days. I mean, compared to what they did in 1950. I mean, just make twice as much horsepower. So you have to be able to legislate that somehow. But generally speaking, philosophically, I don't have a problem with it.
Yeah, I like to. Harry Falkenstein asked, was there corporate resistance at Ford when Phil Remington changed the J car?
No, I think Ford was desperate at that point. I mean, they knew they were kind of up the creek without a paddle, and I mean, it happened very quickly. And he literally went to Dearborn with this car. He reshaped it in 2 days or 3 days in the wind tunnel. They took it out to the test track out in Arizona and tested it, and it immediately was much faster. So yeah, there was no there was no corporate resistance. I don't think Ford was playing favorites. It's not like they liked the Mark II more than the Mark IV. They just wanted to win. So
they just want to win. Yeah. This is a great question. Hernando Pizarro asks about this pivotal scene in the movie. And the scene of the movie is Henry Ford II starting to lose faith in the whole program. He's talking about pulling the plug. And Carroll Shelby engineers this whole thing where Henry Ford II comes out to the airport where Shelby's building the cars and gets him in the GT40. And Carroll takes him around the test track at such a high speed. And it's so scary that the Deuce is actually crying. And after this very dramatic ride, says, "All right, Shelby, you got it. Go do what you want." Did that really happen?
Okay, no. One of my least favorite scenes in the movie. I actually love the scene where Shelby goes to Dearborn and he talks to Ford, in the boardroom and explains why they've actually got Ford after the debacle in '65, and he explains that they have Enzo scared now because they went so much faster than him, even though they didn't win Le Mans. I love that scene. The scene at the one there at LAX was completely made up, and there's nothing like that. I can't imagine Henry Ford II crying after getting a test drive from Shelby. It's just unimaginable to me. I mean, I understand the point they were trying to make, but that never happened, and I don't think it needed to happen. I think they were sold on Shelby anyway at that point, and he was the guy that was going to lead them out of the wilderness. So they didn't need to do anything like that, or lock Leo Beebe in the office, while this happened.
Well, that time in LA, again, if I could go back in time, that may be an era and a place where I would go, because Shelby's shop right there and what is now Marina Del Rey, and for the GT40 they moved. Was their shop right on the LAX runways?
Yeah, they didn't ever test out there like they did in the movies, but they were right there, and they would get shipments in all the time and literally come right off the taxiway, and they unload there. I think the shop, so it was pretty cool. So, but yeah, I got to understand, back then Southern California was still. It wasn't like today where all the race shops now are in Indianapolis or Charlotte. I mean, everything, or a lot of stuff was still in Southern California then. I mean, well into the 50s, all the cars that competed in Indy were built in Southern California.
Well, and I think maybe let me throw out a reason to you and see if you think, because Southern California, with its year-round good weather, had become quite a spot for aerospace development, and especially leading up to and during World War II. So this, especially in the '60s, guys like Carroll Smith started writing books about how to build race cars. And I remember very specifically he talked about this hardware designation called AN. It was called Army Navy.
Right.
It was a specification for nuts and bolts that came from the Army. And according to Carroll Smith, you could go to any surplus shop and buy this fabulous hardware for really cheap. And it took me forever to realize they didn't have those in Jersey, where I grew up, but they had them all over Southern California. So they had this infrastructure of supplies, craftsmen, all kinds of things that really made it kind of an ideal spot to be developing and making those cars. Is that true, would you say?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the whole aerospace industry was based out in Southern California at the time, so they had those guys and they had that equipment. Yeah, you start to see all the AN fittings and all the kind of braided lines that we take now for granted in racing. They didn't exist. Yeah, they were all from aerospace. Plus, that's where hunting existed all over the country. But I think Southern California was really where it really took off. I mean, a lot of the real heroes of hot rodding were based out there. So a lot of the guys that worked for Shelby, they were hot rodders. And I remember talking to some of the British guys. They were saying, like great British fabricators. But the guys at Shelby, they built their own stuff. I mean, they knew how to do it from soup to nuts, like a Remington. You could do everything. And that really helped kind of make a more holistic approach to building a car than maybe they had in other parts of the world.
Okay, so you broke up a little bit there, but then that suggests that a lot of these veterans from World War II that were out racing on the dry lake beds with as fast as they could go. They were really sort of unicorns. They could do everything. They weren't just fabricators or mechanics or welders. They didn't specialize. They sort of knew the whole breadth of how to engineer and build a race car, which I think was kind of unique to that part of the country, and that sort of just roll up your sleeves and get on with it attitude. Would you say that's part of it too?
I think you're absolutely correct. Yeah, absolutely. And again, the whole hot rodding thing was there, and so those guys were really knowledgeable. So
after '67, they shut down the program. Carroll Shelby continues building, his Cobras, the Mustang-based GT cars for a little bit, and then that sort of peters out at the end of the '60s. Carroll reemerges as the performance arm of Dodge and Chrysler in the '80s, but what was he doing in the '70s? I've never really looked into that. What was going on?
I don't really know. Actually, I'm not. I'm with you on that. I'm not really clear on what he was doing. I mean, he had his chili company in Texas, and he was doing some other kind of stuff. But he was very successful with he owned the Goodyear franchise, I think, for the West Coast, and so he sold all Goodyear stuff, racing stuff. So I think he made a lot of money doing that. He actually technically helped found All American Racers with Dan Gurney, although he left it. But Gurney was down there also in Southern California in Anaheim or Santa Ana, which is maybe an hour south of LA, and
Right.
that's where actually All American Racers is to this day. His sons still run the company, so which is pretty cool.
So
But, yeah, I'm not sure what Shelby was doing in the '70s.
well, it'll be something to look into. Maybe that's a fun piece to do in the future. So we're getting ready to wrap up here. Preston, as a guy who's been up to his earlobes in that story, like, what are like the top 2 or 3 things you'd want somebody to know about that incredible 5-year history where Ford and Ferrari were going at it?
Well, the thing that I think is the most important thing to remember is that I think this is the greatest accomplishment of American manufacture in international racing. I mean, not only did they win 2 times in a row, if you count the factory, 4 times if you count the privateers, but I mean, no one really comes close to that. I mean, the Corvettes have won, many times at Le Mans. Am I cutting out there?
No, I was gonna say, dude, what about the Corvettes in recent minutes?
Corvettes,
They've been
but
doing
that's
really well.
those are class wins. I mean, I'm not going to slag off Corvettes. I mean, and those guys have done a brilliant job. But I mean, this was it. This was the pinnacle of American involvement in international motorsports, and it was done at a time when manufacturers weren't involved in racing in the way they are now. Now it's old hat. Everyone expects it. Ford sort of established a template for all that stuff, and I don't think it's possible to overestimate the importance of that.
Yeah, some of the folks I know at Ford, especially in the racing department, they are very clear that racing is in Ford's DNA. When you ever ask them, why do you do it? They like, this is part of who we are. And I think the GT40 program really established that for the company. I mean, I think that's fair to say, don't you?
Yeah, it's funny you say that, and of course we take that for granted now. But when you read Leo Levine's great book, The Dust and the Glory, I mean, there's very little, there's no official racing in Ford's history at all until basically the '60s. I mean, they were involved tangentially in some engine programs and stuff like that, but this was the beginning for Ford, and ever since then, I mean, you think of all the things they've done since then, and been involved in motorsports in a big way ever since. But it all really began back then in the mid '60s with Le Mans, Indy, and
Yeah,
stock
the
cars.
thing, one thing the movie highlights, which I say all the time, like to my friends and my family, and as an amateur racer myself, I love motorsports. At Haggerty, we love motorsports, and but what I always try and tell people as the beauty of professional motorsports is that nobody is there because it's a job. They're all there because they just love it, and they're working their tail off. They're super passionate about it. And the one thing the Ford versus Ferrari movie I thought really captured well were the relationships between these very passionate individuals who, come together over a very deep and strong shared passion that to everybody else looks crazy. But these folks are so driven. This is all they can think of morning, noon, and night. And then they come together and they work it out and they do something really great, which is like this, great expression of the human spirit. So, for all that movie's flaws, it's that part that I thought they really did a great job communicating, and I think that maybe that makes you feel a little bit better about the movie because you did walk away going, "That Shelby was an incredible dude," and I think that's fair to say he was an incredible dude.
No, I think to me, Shelby's. I kind of felt like, well, the movie's really Ken Miles' movie more than Shelby's, but I think Shelby's the one who really could have been he'd be a great movie. He was such a character, and so he was really larger than life, and he was funny, and he was a ladies' man, and he was a raconteur, a pilot during World War II. I mean, it's kind of amazing stuff that you could talk about him, and I didn't think Matt Damon. I thought that Christian Bale nailed Ken Miles from what I read about him. Matt Damon didn't seem anything like Carroll Shelby to me, but.
Well, you got garbled a little bit there. I think we're having some internet trouble.
Oh,
but you're saying, from what you know, Christian Bale faithfully represents.
Yeah, I think he nailed. Yeah, but I don't think Matt Damon really got Shelby at all. At least the Shelby that I knew.
So, thank you. Your book is about to go back in print, so you can go search it up
Yes.
soon. Correct? You and Dave Friedman put that together.
Thank you.
Anything else on your horizon that we should know about? What's kind of interesting? I mean, I kind of like. There's been a lot of books on Shelby, but maybe that's your next big project. Anything you care to share?
Not really working on much. Just would mention again, Dave Friedman. His photos really helped make that book. He did a great job. He was the guy back then. I don't know, but the Shelby project sounds like a good idea. Maybe I'll get to work on that.
Well, thank you for your time, Preston. It was a real pleasure. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Please head over to Hagerty.com/media for more awesome car stuff. We hope you have a great weekend.
Thanks, Larry.
Thank you.